Great to see you. If you're watching online, we're glad that you're watching. If you have a Bible with you, I want you to turn to Isaiah chapter 9. And while you're turning, I want to tell you, I did something a couple weeks ago that I said I would never do. And recently, with the three boys at home, I find myself in that position fairly often. I find myself doing things that I said I would never do. And this time, the thing I did is I put Christmas lights up on the outside of our house. Now, for years, I've resisted doing that because I feel like once you do it the first time, you've got to keep doing it, right? If you did it this year, I got to do it next year. And who wants to make that kind of commitment? But when you're stuck at home for 14 days, you have to do something. So that's what we did. We put up Christmas lights on the outside of our house. And once I got into it, I immediately started thinking, what can I add to this next year that will make this a little better? That's how it starts. Now, I'm not ready to, turn it into a Hallmark movie, but I did have some ideas. And I started looking online. I've got a picture that I want to show you. This is the home of Tim and Grace Gay in LaGrangeville, New York. They're the current Guinness Book of World Records record holders for the most Christmas lights on a residential property. They captured that record in 2014 with 601,000 Christmas lights. Today, that number has climbed to 695 individual lights that are all choreographed to 252 Christmas songs. And together, they and their adult children spend every weekend during the months of September and October putting up this light display. And then throughout the month of December, thousands of people come and take all this in. Now, because I'm a nerd, I started to read a little bit more about this, and I learned that the tradition of putting up Christmas lights actually predates electricity. In fact, it goes all the way back to the 16th century. And there's some evidence that the great reformer, Martin Luther, was the first person to ever put lights on a Christmas tree. And the way the story goes, he was working on a sermon late one cold winter night when he went outside sort of to regroup and catch his breath. And he looked up through the trees that surrounded his house, and he looked up into the winter sky, and he saw these stars that were shining brilliantly against the backdrop of that winter sky. And he was so awed by what he saw that the next morning he cut down a tree, he brought it into the main room of his house, and he strung up candles throughout that tree in hopes of recapturing what he had experienced and sharing it with his family. Now, whether or not that story is true, it does bring up an interesting point, and the point is this: for hundreds of years before electricity, people used candles to light up their Christmas trees. And the problem with that, as you can imagine, is that more often than not, in their efforts to celebrate Christmas, they wound up catching the tree on fire and doing significant damage to their homes. So over the years, they developed this tradition that most people followed, a very strict routine. A few seconds before midnight on Christmas Eve, the family would gather around the tree. The father of the family would then carefully light the candles in each of those candles in that tree. The family would sort of gather in silence around the tree. They would watch as the midnight approached. They would look at these lights. They would celebrate the coming of the Messiah. And then for just a few more seconds, they would watch him. And then immediately they would blow the candles out, hopefully before catching the tree on fire. And I was reading about that. It occurred to me that that's very similar to the way a lot of us celebrate Christmas today. And I'm not talking about, putting candles in your tree. Most of us are beyond that. But what most of us do is we've reduced what should be a months-long or maybe even a year-long celebration of the coming of the Messiah into our world down to just a few seconds in December. And I'm not trying to beat you up because I know how it is. You've got tons of stuff to do. You got to buy gifts. You got to plan parties. You've got to attend church services. You got to plan your trip to grandma's. You got to decorate. You got to cook. And there's just a lot of stuff that goes with this time of year. So sometimes what happens is we get so caught up in all the stuff that goes with this time of year that we go through the motions of Christmas without ever really thinking about the meaning of Christmas. But then you come to a year like this year, and it all feels different. If you look at your calendar for the next month, my suspicion is you'll find that there are a lot of things missing. at least compared to previous years. There aren't as many parties to go to. There are almost no programs to prepare for. And most of us, instead of going from store to store doing your shopping, most of your shopping's done on your cell phone from the comfort of your couch. And for a lot of us, this Christmas in particular looks different and feels different than what we're used to. And maybe that's okay. Over the next few weeks, as a church, I hope that we can take advantage of what looks like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to set aside the distractions that normally, dominate this time of year and use this time to focus on what Christmas is really about. To help us do that, we're kicking off a new series we're calling Light in the Darkness. And we're going to start in Isaiah, the Old Testament book of Isaiah, chapter 9. And just to set this up for you, what we're going to look at was written a little over 700 years before the birth of Jesus. At this point in history, Isaiah, who's a prophet, finds himself living among and working among a group of people who have basically pushed God to the margins. In Isaiah 1, he describes them saying their hearts are far from God. In some sense, in some ways, they're worshiping idols. Others of them, if they haven't given into idol worship, they're outwardly going through the motions of worshiping God, but inwardly, they are deeply disconnected from God. So in response to this, God has decided that he's going to send a series of intense judgments on them that will hopefully prompt some of them to repent of their sin and return to him. And it's Isaiah's job to warn the people about what's going to happen. Now, just to put this in perspective, to deliver this judgment, God is going to use what we would call the Assyrian Empire. I've got a map that I want to show you. The Assyrian Empire was located to the north of the kingdom of Judah, which is where the city of Jerusalem was located. If you look at this map, you can see just how much land they controlled. The Assyrians in the Old Testament were kind of like Nazi Germany. They were bent on expansion. They were going to control the world, and there was nothing that they wouldn't do in order to expand their influence. They were brutal people. And it is against that backdrop that Isaiah tells the people that judgment is coming, and when it comes, it's going to be devastating. But with all the bad news, as you read through this book, you can't help but see that there is a thread of hope. Over and over again, Isaiah reminds the people that even as the world looks increasingly dark, God has not abandoned them. And behind the scenes, God is doing something that will ultimately transform the world. When you get to the end of Isaiah chapter 8, the news is all bad. Everything is bad. God has given Isaiah a vision of the future, and what he sees coming is a devastating invasion of the kingdom of Judah led by the Assyrian Empire. To put this in perspective, this would have been like the Commonwealth of Kentucky fighting against the Nazis. They had no shot. They were outmanned. They were outgunned, and they knew they had no shot. So what do? They start to panic. They're looking for any sort of hope. They're looking for any sort of direction. And Isaiah tells us that they are so desperate for hope that they start consulting with mediums and psychics. Check out the way it says the end of chapter 8, verse 19. When someone tells you to consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? Consult God's instruction and the testimony of warning. If anyone does not speak according to this word, they have no light of dawn. Now check out verse 21. Distressed and hungry, they will roam through the land. When they are famished, they will become enraged, and looking upward will curse their king and their gods. This is a picture of a culture that's being completely torn apart. It's coming apart at the seams. They are so desperate for any glimmer of hope that they're actually trying to communicate with dead people. Then you get to verse 22. It's kind of the summary verse that shows us how bad things are going to get. Verse 22. Then they will look toward the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom. And they will be thrust into utter darkness. Sometimes you read the Bible, you read it too fast, And this is one of those examples. We read this and we don't really feel the impact of what he's saying. And remember, Isaiah is looking off into the future. He's describing something that's going to happen in the future as if it's already happened. And I want you to pay attention to the words he uses to describe their situation. He says, distress, darkness, and fearful gloom. One translation, popular translation, uses the phrase, the gloom of anguish. It's a picture of a kingdom and a culture that has been utterly destroyed. For hundreds of years, they had listened to the wrong voices while at the same time ignoring God's instructions. And now on the back end of that, they find themselves in a situation where they're hungry, increasingly desperate, and enraged. Because of the attack, their food supply chain is broken down, their currency is worthless, and everybody everywhere in that kingdom has a short fuse. I want you to pay attention to the last line in verse 22 where it says, they will be thrust into utter darkness. In Hebrew, that's a word that Isaiah kind of creates that means gloominess. Another word, the literal translation would be this fearful expectation. Everywhere they look, the news is bad, and it's getting worse. Now, I don't know if you noticed this or not, but the last few months in our culture, we've come to this place where we're now like fueled by gloom and doom. I don't want to blame the media for it totally, but if you watch the news any length of time at all, then you know for the most part it's every possible variation of doom and gloom. You turn on the news, here's what you hear. The food supply chain is breaking. The economy's collapsing. The government's corrupt. Nobody can be trusted. The virus is surging. Hospitals are overcrowded. Schools are closing. Stores are struggling. Unemployment's climbing. Substance abuse is skyrocketing. Suicide rates are at an all-time high. And it just goes on and on and on. And even if that's not enough, we've now become experts at turning even good news into bad news. Have you noticed that? The 45 minutes into an hour program, they'll finally report some good news, and they'll follow it up with, but some experts disagree and worry about the long-term effects. Or somebody finally reports something positive, and they'll say, but experts caution us that this could only be the calm before the storm. And if you spend any time on social media at all, it's worse. Just doom and gloom everywhere you look. That's why when you look around, a lot of people are distressed. It's because they feel like they're living in a land of darkness and a land of fearful gloom. And if you can somehow multiply what we're experiencing now times 1,000,000, you start to get just a small taste of what the people in Isaiah's day were dealing with, what they were getting ready to experience. For them, their world was getting ready to be completely torn apart, and everything that they depended on to make their lives worth living was getting ready to be destroyed. You keep reading, you get to verse 1 of Isaiah chapter 9, and what you find is this incredible contrast. Even though Isaiah makes it clear that judgment's coming, it's not a judgment without purpose, it's not a judgment without hope. Even in the midst of all the bad news, there is some hope. And he wants these people to know, hey, things are bad, and they're going to get worse, but eventually, things are going to get better. Check out verse 1 of chapter 9. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. Now again, this can be confusing because Isaiah is looking off in the future. He's describing something, a future event, as if it's already happened. But when the Assyrians finally did launch their attack, they launched their attack in the area known as Zebulun and the area known as Naphtali. That was in the northeast region of Israel, and that's where the trouble started. But you'll notice as you read this, that's not what Isaiah seems to be most concerned about. What he's most focused on here is not the past, but the future. And he says that in the future, God is going to do something in a place called Galilee that will radically transform the world. Now check out what he says next in verse 2. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. Now, throughout the Bible, you see this, the biblical writers talk about this battle that's raging between the light and the darkness. The light represents God and the love of God. The darkness represents the enemies of God. Light represents life, because without light, there's no light, and so darkness represents death. That's why when you get to the New Testament, hell is often described as a place of outer darkness, because it's separated from God. Something else that's interesting, though, is that the Hebrew, the word for light, can also mean, the word for darkness, can also mean ignorance. So if you've ever been kept in the dark on something, that means you were ignorant of its existence. And that's part of what Isaiah is describing here. Not only were the people living in rebellion against God, they were also living in ignorance, in that they didn't have any idea how to solve the problems that were plaguing. That's why in the end of chapter 8, they're trying to consult with mediums and with psychics. Now, the reason they do that is they were out of answers. They'd exhausted all their other options. And you may not agree with me, but that's okay. If the last few months have taught us anything, it's how incredibly incapable we are of solving our own problems. You know, for years there was this belief in human progress that people thought, man, if we can just elect the right people, and if we can just somehow create the right education system and build the right economy, and if we can develop the right technology, then most of the problems that plague us will just sort of fade away. But I don't think most people believe that anymore. If you look around our culture right now, what you see are a lot of increasingly desperate people wandering around in the darkness, searching for some kind of answer to the problems that are haunting them. That's what was happening in Isaiah's day. In verse 2, he puts together these two words. He said they're living in deep darkness. They're going to be thrust into this deep darkness. In Hebrew, it literally means the death shadow. It's as if they were so far removed from God that they were surrounded by death. They were living in the death shadow. That's Isaiah's way of saying that things were about as bad as they could possibly get. But in that environment, there's something extraordinary that happens that changes everything. Isaiah says it with one line. He says, a light has dawned. You ever walked into a dark room and then flipped the light on? What happens to your eyes? If the light is bright enough, initially it's a little bit painful. Those light rays hit your optic nerve, your eyes start to constrict, and you might even see a few spots for a few seconds. But then, once your eyes have adjusted, everything sort of comes into focus. What was once hidden is now revealed. What was once confusing is now clear. And what caused that? It's not that you got smarter, it's that the light got turned on, and the light changes everything. When you get to verse 3, Isaiah paints us a picture of what's going to change once that light dawns. Check out what he says. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. According to Isaiah, the first thing that's going to happen when this light dawns is that the light will bring prosperity. Now, he says you have enlarged the nation. At the end of chapter 8, he's talking about this small group of people that he's hopeful will return back to God once this light arrives. We would call them a remnant of people. But Isaiah makes it clear it's not always going to be just this small group. Eventually, this small group is going to grow and multiply into a literal kingdom of people. In fact, it'll grow so large that when you get the New Testament, it says it'll be a number that nobody can count. And it won't just be a large nation, it'll be a prosperous nation. Rather than being known for famine and destruction, it'll be a kingdom defined by prosperity. And the second thing he says goes right with the first one. He says, when the light finally dawns, it will bring joy. Verse 2 says, you have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest. Now, we know the Christmas season is supposed to be a season of joy, but sometimes it doesn't feel that way. I read an article last week about this mall in Montreal, Canada, that had to be evacuated and closed for 2 days because there was these two groups of people, and they got in this huge fight on Black Friday. Now, they didn't say what the fight was about, but somehow they got, and that's not even unusual anymore. Like you see the news articles, you see the same stories that I see about people who go to the mall and they wind up fighting each other. But what made this one so incredible was that one of the ladies involved in the fight actually had a canister of tear gas tucked away in her purse. And during the fight, she took out the tear gas, she took out the end of it, and she threw it at the people that she was fighting. Now, I was thinking about this. My grandma had a lot of stuff in her purse. I don't think she ever had a canister of tear gas. And if she did, I'm pretty sure she didn't use it. But what in the world could possibly say, hey, love your neighbor like you love yourself, as trying to use a chemical weapon on somebody? Nothing says Christmas like trying to destroy your enemies. But it's not just fights on Black Friday. It's not even the threat of tear gas. There are a lot of other things that combine that make this season a lot more stressful and a lot less joyful than it should be. Financial problems, relationship problems, family dysfunction, work issues, health issues, the death of somebody you love, an unexpected divorce, a health crisis, an uncertain future. I mean, all of that sort of adds up. All of it sort of takes its toll. And then you get to this time of year and it's colder and it gets darker earlier. And if you're not careful, it can kind of mess with you. That's why we need the light. Because the light brings joy when we desperately need it. Something else the light brings is freedom. Check out verse 4. Isaiah says, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. For years, the people of God had been forced to live under the oppression of their enemies. But then when the light arrived, that would be the end of the oppression, and they would finally experience real freedom. Some of you know what it's like to live under a heavy burden. For you, maybe it's a boss with unrealistic expectations. Maybe it's a medical condition that already controls most of your life and seems to be growing worse. Maybe it's an addiction that you can't seem to break free from. I mean, if somebody were to hand you a piece of paper right now and ask you to write down the one thing that you want more than anything else for Christmas, you might use the word freedom, because a lot of you know the pain of living under a burden. That leads to the last thing that Isaiah says the light brings, and that's peace. He says, every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning. It'll be fuel for the fire. Isaiah says that in the future, there's going to be a day when there'll be no armies and there'll be no weapons, because the world will be at peace. I looked it up this week. Do you know right now there are 40 active wars going on planet Earth? Some of them have been going on for 70 years. And that doesn't even count, the hundreds of little skirmishes that you see as, one militia group fights another militia group for control of some piece of property. For most of us, we don't think about that. It's kind of out of sight and out of mind. But for a lot of the world, man, their lives are dominated by war. But it's not just physical war that's taking place. Everywhere you look, there's this spiritual war taking place. It's the battle between light and darkness. And yet Isaiah says that one day in the future, all of that will be over and there will be peace. Now, I want you to look at the list. We're going to put them all up there. And I want you to think about these 4 things: prosperity, joy, freedom, and peace. Now, if you pause to think about it, that's what most of us are chasing after. It's built into our DNA. It's ingrained in us that those are the things that we hope to experience. And yet, the problem in our day, just like it was in Isaiah's day, is that we keep trying to find those things in the wrong places. For some reason, we like to think that those are things that we can somehow find if we would just look in the right places. And if we can't find them, maybe we'll figure out a way to produce them. But that's not what the Bible says. That's why when you get to the end of verse 2, Isaiah says, on those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. The light is not something that we produce, and it's not something that we find. It's something that dawns on us. It doesn't come from within us, and it doesn't even come from within our world. It comes from outside our world, and then it transforms our world. Now here's the really cool part. You get to verse 6 of Isaiah 9, and he tells us more about this light that he's been talking about. Check this out. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he'll be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish. So you read this, and if you don't know what you're reading, it almost seems like he's changing the subject. It almost seems like he's disconnected. He's been talking about this light. He's been talking about what's going to happen when the light dawns. He's been talking about this future of prosperity and joy and peace and freedom and how awesome that's going to be. And then out of nowhere, he starts talking about this child that will one day be born. And when you first read it, it seems like he's sort of changing the subject. Doesn't seem like it fits together. What does the birth of a child have to do with the dawning of the light? But then you step back and you look at the whole picture, what he's just said. It starts to make sense. Here's the key truth that Isaiah is driving home. The light is not a what, it's a who. Now, most time we think of light, we think in terms of something rather than someone. And so we spend our lives chasing the right set of circumstances, the right things, and we think if we just achieve those things, it'll help us be more prosperous, more joyful, experience more freedom, and be more at peace. But then what winds up happening is that over time you start to get some of those things. So you finally get the job you always wanted. You get the raise that enables you to buy the house or the car that you've been dreaming about. And you just keep adding to the pile of things. But as you continue to do that, you discover that nothing really changes. You've got all the things, but nothing's really different. Even though you have everything you ever wanted, it still feels like you're in the dark. Somehow, even with all of the accomplishments, it still feels like you're surrounded by the death shadow. And the reason it feels that way is because you are. That's why Isaiah says the light is not a what. And it's not even a combination of several different whats. It's a who. So you look at what he says here. There are 4 names or 4 titles that Isaiah applies to this child that can help us identify him. First, he calls him the Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. And in the Jewish culture, all 4 of those titles or those labels were things that could only be applied to God himself. For example, only God could accurately be called mighty because only God is all-powerful. Only God could accurately be called the everlasting God because God doesn't exist in time. He exists outside of time. He's not bound by our sense of time. Only God could be called a Wonderful Counselor because he has all knowledge. He's not limited by the same limitations that human counselors have to deal with. So you can tell that by using these 4 titles, Isaiah is referring to God. But what makes this so interesting is that when he uses that phrase, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given. Now stay with me. Stay with me. This is really important. In the Jewish culture, all 4 of those titles or those 4 phrases are things that can only be applied to. And if Isaiah is accurately using those 4 phrases and applying them to this child that he's talking, that means that he wants us to know. He wants us to know that the child that'll be born is not just any child. It's God. It's God in the flesh. Wonderful Counselor. Because make sure you understand, Isaiah is not just saying, there's going to be a king born, he's going to be a great warrior, and he's going to be a great political leader, and one day he's going to rule, one day he's going to right all the wrongs. It's way more than that. He's saying this child that's going to be born is God. Now you can spend
spend the rest of your life. You can study every religion that you can think of, and you won't find anything that comes close to this. The idea that God came to earth in the form of a helpless baby. When you get to the New Testament, make sure we don't miss the point. Jesus identified exactly who Isaiah was talking about. John chapter 8. John records it. Jesus spoke again to the people. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness. Will have the light. I got another picture. I was reading about the home of Tim Race Gay. There they are. That's their family. And I came across this newspaper article in which Mr. Gay was asked how the family got started doing this. What prompted them to keep adding all these lights until the point that they were the world record. And I want you to listen to his response. He told the newspaper, we did not imagine this. It was not a goal. It just kind of happened. Then he went on. He explained how when he was a kid, his mother really loved Christmas. She loved to decorate for Christmas. That was part of his. Grew older and got married, had his first child, a daughter named Emily. You can see her sort of leaning against the tree. He wanted to share that with her, and it just sort of started that way. And he told the reporter, that's how simple it was. It was the birth of a child. It was motivated by that sense of wonder that I think we all feel about life, and I wanted that to be a part of my children. From there, the reporter went on and sent several paragraphs about the particulars of the display. The number of lights, the timeline of how they put it all together, how much it cost, and all that. But then right at the end of the order, asked the daughter Emily. He went on to explain how he said, "Do you think that this is just a giant? That was part of his from your dad." He got married, had his first. To which Emily replied, I couldn't have said it myself. He wanted to share that with her, and it just sort of started that. He told the reporter, that's how simple it was. For Emily, every time she sees 641,000 lights shining against the darkened sky, and she's reminded of the incredible love that her earthly father has. But even as much as her earthly father, it doesn't compare to how much our heavenly Father loves us. Rather than just being content to bring a few thousand lights to hang them on the outside of a house that we'll never live in, and rather than being satisfied with billions of stars shining in the winter sky, your heavenly Father chose to enter our world in the form of a helpless baby. And if what Isaiah said is true, it changes everything. Listen to these words from Tim Keller. He said, if there's a God, and if he sent Jesus Christ into the world to die for us, if he was born as a baby, and he died for us, and he rose triumphant over the grave, and he's the pastor of heaven, and is now seated at the right hand of God the Father, and he's ruling all things until he puts everything under his feet, and someday we're to rule and reign with him. If that's true, there's light and there's comfort. If it's not true, there's no comfort and there's no light. Isaiah said, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, the light has dawned. I want you to stand. The band's going to come. We're going to have just a brief invitation. And if all of this is true, if the light has really dawned, that means there's only one question that matters. It's the question, are you walking in the light or are you living in darkness? If you're walking in light, then you should be experiencing a greater degree of prosperity and joy and freedom and peace. If you're living in the darkness, then with each passing day, you're getting further and further away from each of those things. So if you're here this morning and you're not yet walking in the light, we'd love to help you do that.